Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. For this series, my guests and I are discussing an important topic: how to support students from diverse backgrounds, students of color in particular, to feel prepared and empowered for successful professional futures within and outside the academy. We'll also be talking about how academic publishers can play a part by fostering diverse voices in research in the classroom and beyond. Joining me for this discussion is Dr. Rihana Shiri Mason, a research scientist at Georgia State University's Urban Child Study Center and an adjunct faculty member at Spelman College, Dr. Pamela Queen, associate professor in finance at Morgan State University, Miranda Nunhofer, vice president of research at Sage Publishing, and Todd Baldwin, vice president, library editorial and DC executive lead at Sage Publishing. In our final episode of this series, which is sponsored by Sage Publishing, we'll examine the scholarly ecosystem a little more closely, including how the incentive structures built into academic publishing in the academy are influencing, for good or for bad, how today's diverse student body is participating in the academic project. One of the ideas that I think has been just beneath the surface in our discussion to this point are the incentive structures built into academic publishing and the academy more generally. In some ways, there are pretty clearly defined paths in the academic world, like PhD, postdoc, tenure-track job. But these days, with the increasing reliance on non-tenure positions and adjuncts, those formulas are kind of breaking down. So this is sort of a two-part question, I guess. First, how have the existing structures made participation difficult for the more diverse student body that's now participating in the academic project? And two, how do you see the pressures that academia is under changing the opportunities for those diverse students? Are they making things more difficult, easier, and why? And Pam, I'll start with you on that.
So when I think about the pathways for in academia and some of the differences, this is probably one of the times when we're seeing a very clear and distinct difference between, again, what the PhD degree is. And as I alluded to before, it's very research-based. And so you're looking for those who are pursuing those degrees to primarily come back and teach at university and help with developing students to either go into a career track or a teaching track. But when I look at the role of adjuncts and non-tenure track faculty, I think we are beginning to see that they have an important role also in academia, especially as we look at some of the professional certifications that schools are doing or an executive master's program. Those experiences that they bring are very helpful to that. And so, and quite often you can attract more, of course, students of color, women in executive master's program. And so if your goal is to, like the PhD project, is to get more diversity in the boardroom, some of the adjuncts and non-tenure track faculty are very helpful in helping with that process. The PhD project has done a good job of producing PhDs in business. It started in around 1994. We're up to about 1,500 minority PhDs throughout the U.S. And so it's a slow process, but it's getting there. So I see that there is a very important role of both the research-based track of a PhD versus adjunct and non-tenure track, especially as we look to attract more international students who are looking at concepts and thoughts that are more so diverse in other cultures, how we deal internationally. And some of those experiences are best taught by non-tenure track faculty or adjuncts who are both working in the field as well as teaching. So I see it as a positive and can be a good thing for choice for our students.
And Rihana, anything to add there?
I just have a few things to add about the existing structures and sort of the way in which we're living in now. I would really love for us to keep some of the ways of doing things that we have learned how to do during this time of pandemic, when we realized that we didn't all have to be in the same spaces and we could connect, in from our homes, from whatever environments that we're in, from our lab spaces. So to connect virtually, but then also to connect with larger groups and audiences, even internationally. I think a lot of scholarship has become more collaborative in that way. We may have been averse to Zooms and WebExes before, but have figured out how to expand even our scholarship with international audiences because of technology. But then I also think when we return, the part of inclusivity and remembering who we are in our humanness needs to remain. So the example that I'm thinking about, that we've kind of been challenged with in this virtual space now, there are reasons why, let's say, when we join in a virtual realm, we don't have our cameras on. And that doesn't just allow us to be kind of flexible in the background, but it does allow us to engage in our work in a way that allows us to bring our best selves in whatever nature, that may be. And then, secondly, something that we've learned how to do a little bit better is expand our virtual realm to include better closed captioning. We're not all the way there yet, and not all of our virtual meetings are including that. But I think knowing that there's a community, an audience that is engaged that need that closed captioning, and to make sure that the translation also includes the various dialects and accents and speaker variability. I'm also hoping that we can continue to make strides in that area. Now, some of those things aren't mentioned, in our book as part of the academic pipeline project, but I do think being attentive to our diverse learning needs, and I think someone mentioned that earlier, is part of what we say about making spaces equitable and safe for whomever's in them.
Mm-hmm. Great. Todd and Miranda, I'm wondering if you could provide some perspective from the publisher angle, as Sage kind of experiences changes happening in academia in general. How do you see your portfolios or workflows changing along with that?
I'm happy to start on this one. I guess one of the things that we're very conscious of at Sage is the role that journals have in going back to the sort of the careers of academics. And I think we have to, we're really, the journals in particular are a really key part of the kind of accreditation and tenure process, and it varies across the globe in terms of how journal articles are valued, but they have a really important role to play in people's careers. And so we've actually been doing a huge amount of work this last year, really scrutinizing, not for the first time, but with very new perspectives, the whole sort of process and the workflows around our journals publishing, and having really important conversations with our editors, our editorial boards, around questions of diversity on their editorial boards, around biases in the system. Obviously, publishing is a very human process, and there's inherently in that process, there are lots of places where biases can come into play. And so we've been looking at that from a sort of a reviewer perspective, from editorial board perspective, talking to our editors about how they can improve all of these different points along the way. I just to echo what was said really around what the opportunities as well that have arisen in this last year. The just editorial board meetings can be so much more inclusive. There's no question that academic publishing has a very Western bias, North bias, and that's a really big thing that we need to tackle. But this has allowed for much more inclusive working together across the globe, which I think has been really powerful and really important and something we should build on. Todd, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from my perspective, it's our content and author bases are absolutely are changing, and they'll have to continue to change. I think we've talked a little bit about that, but I do think it's true that if you think from a workflow process, we have to just think differently about how we're developing and delivering our content. We're going to see more textbooks in our publishing program that take an explicit approach to course content with the lens of diversity, equity, or intersectionality. And our workflows are already changing to account for the content development that puts DEI at the center. We have new guidelines that support both authors and editors to identify and remedy bias in their content. And we're just making sure that we're doing a better job with things like terminology and making sure that we're aware of the voices that we're missing. We're still learning, though. It's funny. We have a longstanding. It's coming up on its 100th year anniversary. CQ Researcher. It's a long-established product that's long rested on its promise of delivering balanced, in-depth, objective journalism. We're learning from library feedback that formula is challenged. Even the notion of objectivity, which is imperfect in the first place, as we all know, is a concept that's often biased towards a white power structure. And so we had a recent report on policing that asked the question, can the police regain trust? The writer and editor were in that question, the question that they were asking, asserting that the police were not a trusted institution and that to be effective, they needed to regain that trust. That's objective, but it's objective from the standpoint of an overwhelmingly white institution. From a Black student's perspective, that might be that the police never had their trust and that sustaining the institution is simply preserving white privilege. So how do we identify that subtle perceptual shift that we need to make? How do we make sure that we're getting those historically marginalized perspectives into our content so we're not leaving that student behind? That means more writers of color, but also it means, as we've been talking about several times today, advisory boards who can help us to understand our biases, help us to frame issues or questions in a way that's inclusive. And the landscape of opportunities to do that is constantly changing. So one of the other things that I just want to point out in terms of ways that we can bring more voices into the room is that the pandemic, that forced us into the lockdown, but it also gave us a new opportunity for filming talent. So we created something called the mobile studio, which allows us to capture film content from people in their own homes or places of work, no matter how far away they are. And so that means that we don't have to rely on people to travel. We don't have to rely on people to be at conferences. And we quickly realized that this helped us to optimize our mission to diversify our content even more, because we're not beholden to all of those things: travel, film studios, conferences, et cetera. And so what we're doing is we're continuing to find those opportunities to bring more voices into the overall picture, and that we also helps to advance what we think is the set of voices that in academia, making sure that everybody feels included.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Do some of the issues we were speaking just a little bit earlier have similar impacts on students who go on to roles outside of academia, or are there like a unique set of considerations for this cohort? Pam, I'm thinking of your work to prepare students for the boardroom experience, so to speak.
Yes, so some of the things, much of what you discussed is certainly important as we talk about issues of students who are going into the workforce. And so what I'm looking at as I'm looking at materials to provide and put in front of students, I talked about the cases and how they're helpful in helping with decision making and issues that are tough problems, data to support those issues. But one of the things that I do find sometimes is hard to find to supplement the books that we have, and of course journal articles, are to have just more up-to-date sort of data and opinions pieces. And so I'm starting to send students to op-eds in newspapers or special articles, blogs that people are doing online, to be part of those sort of discussions. And we often set up a discussion board in the class to talk about various articles that may have started from an opinion piece or something in the newspaper or some sort of what we call popular media. That sort of information, bringing that into the classroom has always been, a problem, because that's not what you can find out of a textbook, but how we can readily do that and provide that sort of dialogue and questions and topics and make those issues very relevant, as I talked before about the cases, very relevant to those students and their perspective and what they're seeing. And so trying to make sure that we have a larger source of publishing materials that can help supplement those classroom experiences is one of the things we can use and help with.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, that's all the time we have. So Pam, Rihana, Todd, and Miranda, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You just heard from Dr. Rihana Shiri Mason, a research scientist at Georgia State University's Urban Child Study Center and an adjunct faculty member at Spelman College, Dr. Pamela Queen, associate professor in finance at Morgan State University, Miranda Nunhofer, vice president of research at Sage Publishing, and Todd Baldwin, vice president, library editorial and DC executive lead at Sage Publishing. Sage Publishing is the sponsor of this 4-part series of The Authority File. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.